When my son shouted, "My mother-in-law's cooking is better," and spit out my food in front of my wealthy in-laws, my daughter-in-law smiled victoriously. What they didn't know was that the recipe for the food they despised actually held the stolen secret upon which his mother-in-law had built her entire fortune. And I was about to prove it. Justice must be served, and arrogance must be punished. You won't believe what I did next. Before we continue, please remember to like our video and share your first thoughts about this story in the comments. I am Marilyn. I am 65 years old and live in Albany, New York. 5 months ago, I lost the love of my life, my dear husband, to a relentless illness. Now, I try to get by alone in this small house filled with our memories, living on the widow's pension the state provides. All my life, the only thing I knew was to love. And I showed my love in the kitchen. Every cookie I baked for my son, Noah, was a prayer for his success. Every cake I made for my grandchildren was a declaration of my longing for them. After my husband's death, the kitchen became my sanctuary, my lifeline. My son Noah, 35 years old, was a successful man, perhaps a bit arrogant, but I thought he loved me. Until Charlie entered his life. Charlie, 30 years old, always dressed in the latest fashion, smelling of expensive perfumes, but behind that chic smile was a jealous and manipulative soul who looked down on my humble life. After he married her, my son slowly drifted away from me. Charlie's family, the Delaney's, were well-known, wealthy figures in New York. Her mother, Noah's new mother-in-law, Mrs. Delaney, was an old-school woman, considered an authority in the kitchen, a figure everyone respected. That evening, I was surprised when Charlie invited me to dinner. It was to be at their house, with her entire family. "My mother will be there too, Marilyn. Maybe you can learn a thing or two from her," she had said on the phone, with sarcastic politeness. Still, I was filled with hope. I was going to see my son, my grandchildren. I decided to prepare that special dish my husband had taught me, the one our family had made for generations. I spent 3 days in the kitchen. I chose every ingredient with care, poured my love into it. This meal was my way of telling them, I am still here. When we sat at the table, the atmosphere was icy. Expensive china, silver cutlery, and my homemade meal. Noah was sitting next to his mother-in-law, Mrs. Delaney. With all eyes on me, Noah took a big bite of my food. He chewed for a few seconds, his face wrinkled. And then, my son spit out my food onto that expensive table, in front of everyone. It was as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. I froze. My eyes burned, but I couldn't cry. Noah wiped his mouth with a napkin and looked at me with disgust. The mockery in his voice stabbed my heart like a knife. "Mom," he said loudly, as if wanting everyone to hear. "This is horrible. My mother-in-law's cooking is 1,000 times better than this. You are truly incompetent." My lips trembled, but I couldn't say a word. My pride was shattered on that table, along with my son's spit. I glanced at my daughter-in-law. Charlie was smiling faintly, like a victorious commander. Her mother, Mrs. Delaney, gave me a cold look, as if to say, I expected as much. In that moment, I saw the arrogance in my son's eyes. He wasn't my son anymore. He had become a puppet for his wealthy wife and her powerful family. I quietly stood up from the table. No sound came from behind me. But that night, when I returned home, my eyes fell upon my husband's old chest while I was crying. Inside it was an old recipe book from his mother, one that even I had almost forgotten. And in that book, there wasn't just a recipe, but also a dirty secret about how Mrs. Delaney had earned her famous fortune. Now, it was time for revenge. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I sat in my small kitchen with a cup of cold tea in my hands, staring at the old recipe book my husband's mother had left behind. The pages were yellowed and fragile, smelling of dust and time. My fingers trembled as I turned each page carefully, afraid they might crumble under my touch. And then I found it, tucked between 2 pages like a forgotten photograph. A handwritten letter dated 1987, written by my late mother-in-law, Margaret, addressed to someone named Elena Hartwick. My heart skipped a beat when I read that surname, because Elena Hartwick was Mrs. Delaney's maiden name, the very woman who had watched me get humiliated at that dinner table just hours ago. The letter was short, but devastating. Margaret wrote about how she and Elena had been close friends in their youth, how they used to cook together, share recipes, and dream about opening a restaurant someday. But then something happened that broke their friendship forever. Elena had stolen Margaret's signature recipe, the same one that had been passed down through generations in our family. The one I had cooked that very evening. She had taken that recipe, along with several others, and published them under her own name in a cookbook that became a bestseller in the early 90s. That cookbook had launched Mrs. Delaney's entire culinary empire. She had opened restaurants, appeared on television cooking shows, sold kitchen products, and built a fortune estimated at over $30 million. And it was all based on recipes she had stolen from my husband's mother, recipes that rightfully belonged to our family. My hands shook as I held that letter. Margaret had written that she had proof. Photographs of handwritten recipes with dates, witnesses who knew the truth. But she never pursued it legally because she was dying of cancer and didn't have the strength or money to fight a wealthy woman's lawyers. She wrote that she hoped someday someone in the family would find this letter and make things right. I pressed the letter against my chest and cried. Not just for myself and the humiliation I had suffered, but for Margaret, who had died knowing her life's work had been stolen and celebrated by someone else. The recipe I had cooked tonight wasn't just food, it was my family's legacy, and my son had spit it out without knowing he was rejecting his own heritage. But my tears dried quickly, replaced by something else entirely. A cold, determined anger that settled in my bones like steel. I wasn't going to let this injustice continue. Mrs. Delaney had built her fortune on lies and theft, and my son had chosen her over me without knowing the truth. It was time to expose everything. The next morning, I called my old friend Dorothy, who worked as a librarian at the Albany Public Library. If anyone could help me find historical records and evidence, it was her. Within 2 days, Dorothy had located newspaper articles from the late 80s mentioning Margaret's small catering business, including one with a photograph of her holding a dish that looked exactly like the one in Mrs. Delaney's famous cookbook. I also found Margaret's old business license, receipts for ingredients she had purchased, and even a handwritten menu from a charity event she had catered in 1986, 2 full years before Mrs. Delaney's cookbook was published. The menu featured the exact same dishes that later appeared in that best-selling book. But I needed more than just old papers and photographs. I needed someone who had been there, someone who could testify to the truth. And that's when I remembered Father Mateo. Father Mateo was an old priest who had served at our local church for over 40 years before retiring. He was now in his late 70s, living in a modest apartment near the church with his daughter, Isabella, who took care of him. My husband had mentioned once that Father Mateo had been friends with both Margaret and Elena back in the day, that he had even tried to mediate their friendship when it fell apart. I decided to visit him, hoping his memory was still sharp and that he might be willing to help me. When I knocked on his door that cold November afternoon, I had no idea that this visit would change everything, not just for my revenge, but for my entire understanding of what justice really meant. Isabella opened the door, a woman in her early 40s, with tired eyes, but a warm smile. She recognized me from church and invited me in immediately. The apartment was small but clean, filled with religious icons and the smell of homemade soup. Father Mateo was sitting in an old armchair by the window, a blanket over his legs, reading a Bible with a magnifying glass. When he looked up and saw me, his face broke into a gentle smile that made all the wrinkles around his eyes deepen. His voice was soft but clear when he spoke, as if every word was a small prayer. "Marilyn, my child, it has been too long. Please, sit down. Isabella, bring our guests some tea." I sat across from him and explained why I had come. I showed him the letter, the photographs, all the evidence I had gathered. As I spoke, his expression changed from curiosity to sadness, and finally to something that looked like relief, as if he had been waiting decades for this conversation to happen. Father Mateo closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old memories that had been locked away for far too long. I knew this day would come eventually. Margaret was a good woman, one of the kindest souls I ever knew. And Elena, well, she was ambitious, always wanting more than what she had. I tried to reconcile them when their friendship broke, but Elena refused to admit what she had done. She said that recipes couldn't be owned, that food was meant to be shared. But we both knew it wasn't about sharing. It was about stealing and taking credit for someone else's art. He opened his eyes and looked directly at me with an intensity that made me sit up straighter. I can testify to everything you need, Marilyn. I remember those recipes. I remember watching Margaret create them, teaching them to Elena as a gesture of friendship. I even have my own proof, something I've kept all these years, because I always believed the truth would need to be told someday. My heart was pounding as Father Matteo asked Isabella to bring him a small wooden box from his bedroom. When she returned and handed it to him, he opened it carefully and pulled out a stack of old photographs and a notebook. The photographs showed Margaret and Elena together in a kitchen, laughing, cooking, clearly the best of friends. The dates written on the back of the photos ranged from 1982 to 1987, but it was the notebook that made my breath catch in my throat. It was Margaret's personal recipe journal, the original one, with handwritten notes, corrections, little drawings in the margins, and most importantly, dates that proved these recipes existed years before Mrs. Delaney's cookbook was ever published. Margaret gave this to me for safekeeping shortly before she died, Father Matteo explained. She made me promise that if anyone from her family ever came looking for the truth, I would give them this journal and tell them everything I knew. She didn't have the strength to fight Elena herself, but she hoped someone else would. Tears streamed down my face, but this time they weren't tears of sadness or humiliation. They were tears of purpose, of knowing that I wasn't alone in this fight, that my mother-in-law had trusted that someone would carry on her legacy and demand justice. Isabella sat down next to her father and placed a gentle hand on my arm. Her voice was compassionate but firm when she spoke. My father has been waiting to tell this story for years. We will help you, Marilyn. Whatever you need, we will stand with you. The truth deserves to be heard, no matter how powerful the people who want to keep it hidden. Over the next 2 weeks, my small kitchen became a war room. Father Matteo and Isabella visited me almost daily, bringing more evidence, helping me organize everything into a clear timeline that would be impossible to dispute. Isabella, it turned out, was a paralegal who worked for a small law firm downtown. She knew exactly how to present evidence in a way that would hold up legally, and she volunteered to help me prepare everything at no cost. "This isn't just about your family anymore, Marilyn," she told me one evening as we sorted through old photographs. "This is about every person who has ever had their work stolen, their credit taken by someone with more money and power. My father has carried the guilt of staying silent for too long. This is his chance to make things right, and I want to help him do that." Meanwhile, I hadn't heard from Noah at all since that disastrous dinner. No phone call, no apology, nothing. It was as if I had ceased to exist for him the moment I walked out of that dining room. The silence hurt more than his words had, but it also hardened my resolve. If my own son could discard me so easily, then he needed to learn that actions have consequences, that family loyalty should never be traded for social status and wealth. But I wasn't ready to confront them yet. I needed one more piece of the puzzle, something that would make my case absolutely undeniable. That's when Isabella suggested we hire a private investigator to look into Mrs. Delaney's past, to see if there were any other instances of her taking credit for other people's work. The investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Rachel who had retired from the police force, found something within a week that made my blood run cold. Mrs. Delaney hadn't just stolen from Margaret. There were at least 3 other women, all former friends or employees, who had accused her over the years of taking their recipes and ideas without credit. 2 of them had tried to sue her in the 90s, but they had been crushed by her expensive lawyers and forced to sign non-disclosure agreements in exchange for small settlements. Rachel managed to track down one of these women, a chef named Gloria, who was now in her 60s and living in Boston. When we called her and explained what we were doing, Gloria broke down crying on the phone. She agreed to provide her testimony and any evidence she still had, even though it meant potentially breaking her non-disclosure agreement. "I've lived with the shame of staying silent for 25 years, Gloria said through her tears. "If you're actually going to stand up to that woman, then I want to help. She destroyed my career and my reputation. It's time someone finally exposed her for what she really is." With Gloria's testimony added to everything else, our case was becoming bulletproof. But Isabella cautioned me about something important. "Marilyn, even with all this evidence, Taking on someone as wealthy and connected as Mrs. Delaney won't be easy. She will come after you with everything she has. Her lawyers will try to intimidate you, discredit you, maybe even threaten you with countersuits. You need to be absolutely sure you're ready for this fight, because once we start, there's no turning back. I thought about her warning all night, sitting in my dark kitchen with only the moonlight coming through the window. Was I really ready to take on a woman who had millions of dollars and powerful connections? Was I prepared for the possibility that my son might hate me even more? That I might lose whatever small chance I had of reconciling with him? But then I thought about Margaret, about how she had died knowing her life's work had been stolen and celebrated by a thief. I thought about Gloria and the other women whose careers had been destroyed. I thought about my own humiliation at that dinner table, my son spitting out food that represented generations of family love and tradition. No, I decided. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about justice, about standing up for everyone who had ever been silenced by wealth and power. Even if Noah never forgave me, even if I lost him forever, I had to do this. Some things are more important than a relationship with a son who doesn't respect you anyway. The next morning, I called Isabella and told her I was ready to move forward. She came over that afternoon with a lawyer from her firm, a young man named Marcus who specialized in intellectual property cases. He reviewed all our evidence carefully, asking detailed questions, taking notes, occasionally nodding with approval. After 3 hours, Marcus looked up at me with serious eyes and said something I will never forget. "Mrs. Hayes, I have to be honest with you. This is one of the strongest cases I've seen in years. The evidence is overwhelming, the timeline is clear, and having Father Mateo and Gloria as witnesses gives us incredible credibility. If we play this right, we won't just win a legal case, we will destroy Mrs. Delaney's entire reputation. But that's also why she will fight with everything she has. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed?" I met his gaze without flinching and said the words that would set everything in motion. "Yes, I want to proceed. File the lawsuit." Marcus nodded and began preparing the paperwork. Within a week, we filed a civil lawsuit against Mrs. Delaney and her company for copyright infringement, fraud, and unjust enrichment. We demanded financial damages, public acknowledgement of the theft, and a formal apology to Margaret's memory and our family. We also sent copies of our evidence to several major newspapers and food industry publications, letting them know that a major story was about to break. The response was immediate and explosive. Within 2 days, Mrs. Delaney's lawyers contacted us, demanding we drop the lawsuit immediately and threatening to sue me for defamation and harassment. They offered me $50,000 to go away quietly and sign a non-disclosure agreement. Exactly, like they had done with the other women decades ago. Marcus laughed when he read their offer. "They're scared, Marilyn. Really scared. If they weren't, they would just ignore us or file a motion to dismiss. The fact that they're already trying to buy your silence means they know their case is weak. We're not taking any settlement, are we?" "Absolutely not," I replied firmly. "I want the truth to come out. I want everyone to know what she did." And that's when things started getting really interesting. 2 days after we rejected their settlement offer, I received a phone call from Noah. His voice on the other end was cold and angry, nothing like the son I had raised. "Mom, what the hell are you doing? Charlie's mother is furious. She says you're suing her with fake evidence, trying to extort money from her family. This is embarrassing for all of us. You need to drop this ridiculous lawsuit immediately and apologize." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady despite the pain. His words caused, "Noah, everything in that lawsuit is true. Your grandmother's recipes were stolen by Mrs. Delaney. And I have proof. If you actually cared enough to look at the evidence, instead of just believing whatever your wife and her mother tell you, you would see that." He scoffed, and I could hear Charlie's voice in the background, saying something I couldn't quite make out. "You're delusional, Mom. My mother-in-law is a respected businesswoman. Nobody is going to believe some sad old widow with fake documents. You're just jealous of their success and trying to get attention. This is pathetic." Those words hit me like a physical blow, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Noah, I am your mother. I loved you and raised you to be better than this. But if you choose to stand with people who built their fortune on theft and lies, then that's your choice. I will continue to seek justice, whether you support me or not." There was a long silence on the other end. When he spoke again, his voice was even colder. "If you don't drop this lawsuit, Mom, I never want to see you or speak to you again. You will be dead to me. Do you understand? You're going to lose your only son over this stupid obsession." Tears streamed down my face, but my voice didn't waver. "Then I guess I've already lost you, Noah. Because I'm not dropping anything. Goodbye." I hung up the phone and collapsed into a chair, sobbing harder than I had cried since my husband died. Isabella, who had been waiting in the next room during the call, came and held me while I cried. She didn't say anything, just let me grieve for the son I had apparently lost, the boy who had once promised to always take care of his mother, who had hugged me and told me I was his hero. The next few weeks were a nightmare. Mrs. Delaney's public relations team went into full attack mode, releasing statements to the press calling me a con artist, a bitter old woman trying to exploit a successful family for money. They claimed that all the evidence I had presented was fabricated, that Father Mateo was senile and unreliable, that Gloria was a disgruntled former employee with an axe to grind. Several food bloggers and industry publications, many of whom had close relationships with Mrs. Delaney and her brand, published articles questioning my motives and credibility. I was portrayed as a villain, a jealous nobody, trying to bring down a beloved culinary icon. The comment sections of these articles were filled with people calling me horrible names, saying I should be ashamed of myself, that I was just trying to get money I hadn't earned. It was brutal and exhausting. And there were many nights when I wondered if Marcus and Isabella had been right to warn me about how hard this would be. My phone rang constantly with reporters asking for comments, some sympathetic but most skeptical or openly hostile. I had to disconnect my landline and change my cell phone number just to get some peace. But something unexpected happened in the middle of all this chaos, something that reminded me why I was fighting in the first place. Other women started coming forward, reaching out through Marcus's law office, saying they too had been victims of Mrs. Delaney's theft over the years. Some had worked in her restaurants and had their signature dishes stolen and added to menus without credit. Others had been friends or acquaintances who had shared family recipes only to see them appear in Mrs. Delaney's later cookbooks with no acknowledgement. One woman, a pastry chef named Yolanda, had a particularly heartbreaking story. She had worked for Mrs. Delaney in the early 2000s, developing a unique dessert that became the flagship item at one of the restaurants. Mrs. Delaney had promised Yolanda a partnership and credit for her creation, but instead, she fired Yolanda right before the restaurant's grand opening and claimed the dessert as her own invention. Yolanda had tried to speak up, but Mrs. Delaney threatened to ruin her reputation in the industry if she said anything. 20 years later, Yolanda was still working as a line cook in someone else's kitchen, her dreams destroyed. All these women wanted to join our lawsuit, to add their voices to the case against Mrs. Delaney. Marcus was thrilled because each new testimony made our case stronger and harder to dismiss. But more than that, I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't expected. This wasn't just about my family's stolen recipes anymore. It was about giving voice to everyone who had been silenced by power and money, about proving that even the wealthy and connected couldn't escape justice when the truth was on your side. Father Mateo's health began to decline during this period, the stress of the lawsuit taking a toll on his already fragile body. Isabella was worried about him, but the old priest insisted on continuing, despite his doctor's concerns. "I've waited 40 years to tell this truth," he told us during one of our convent system meetings, his hands shaking as he held a cup of tea. "I'm not backing down now, no matter what happens to me. God will give me the strength to see this through." His determination inspired all of us, even on the darkest days when it felt like the whole world was against us. Isabella took time off from her regular job to focus on helping with the case, and I could see how much this meant to her, being able to support her father in something so important to him. The bond between them was beautiful, the kind of parent-child relationship I had once hoped to have with Noah, but had clearly lost somewhere along the way. About a month after we filed the lawsuit, we got our first real breakthrough in court. Mrs. Delaney's lawyers had filed a motion to dismiss our case, arguing that the recipes were too common and generic to be protected, that we had no real proof of theft, and that the statute of limitations had expired. But Marcus had prepared a brilliant response, presenting our timeline of evidence so clearly that even the judge seemed impressed. The hearing was held on a cold January morning. I sat in the courtroom with Isabella, Father Matteo, Gloria, and several other women who had come forward. On the other side of the room sat Mrs. Delaney with her team of expensive lawyers, all dressed in perfect suits and projecting an air of absolute confidence. She didn't even glance in my direction, as if I wasn't worth acknowledging. But when Marcus began presenting our evidence, showing the judge the photographs, the dated recipes, the testimony from multiple witnesses, I saw something flicker across Mrs. Delaney's face. It wasn't fear exactly, but it wasn't confidence either. It was the look of someone who suddenly realized they might actually lose. The judge, a woman in her 50s named Judge Rodriguez, listened carefully to both sides. When Mrs. Delaney's lead lawyer argued that the recipes were too common to be protected, Judge Rodriguez interrupted him sharply. "Counselor, I have reviewed the evidence submitted by the plaintiff. These are not simple recipes for chocolate chip cookies or spaghetti. These are complex, unique preparations with specific techniques and ingredient combinations. If the plaintiff can prove that her mother-in-law created these recipes and that the defendant published them without permission or credit, that constitutes intellectual property theft, regardless of how much time has passed." Mrs. Delaney's lawyer tried to argue about the statute of limitations, but Judge Rodriguez shut that down too. The clock on the statute of limitations begins when the victim discovers the theft, not when the theft occurred. Mrs. Hayes only recently discovered the extent of the defendant's actions. The motion to dismiss is denied. This case will proceed to trial. The courtroom erupted in whispers and murmurs. I saw Mrs. Delaney lean over and say something harsh to her lawyer, who nodded nervously. Isabella squeezed my hand, and Father Matteo smiled peacefully, as if he had known all along that the truth would prevail. We left the courthouse that day feeling victorious, but Marcus warned us that this was just the beginning. "She's going to fight even harder now," he said as we stood on the courthouse steps, surrounded by reporters shouting questions. "Her reputation is on the line, and she knows it. Expect things to get ugly." He was right. Within days, Mrs. Delaney's team launched a full investigation into my life, looking for anything they could use to discredit me. They found out about the small debt I had accumulated after my husband's death, about the times I had been late on rent, about every tiny mistake or imperfection in my modest life. They tried to paint me as financially desperate and willing to lie for money, but they also made a huge mistake. In their desperation to find dirt on me, they started investigating Father Matteo and Isabella too. They hired private investigators to follow them, to dig into their finances, to look for any scandal or weakness they could exploit. And that's when they crossed a line that would end up destroying them. One of these private investigators approached Isabella's employer, a small but respected law firm, and suggested that Isabella was involved in some kind of illegal scheme, trying to extort money from a wealthy client. The investigator implied that the firm should fire Isabella immediately to avoid being associated with the scandal. But Isabella's boss, a sharp lawyer named Miss C. Chen, didn't fall for it. Instead, she called Marcus and told him exactly what had happened. "This is witness intimidation," Miss Chen said firmly. "And it's illegal. You need to report this to Judge Rodriguez immediately." Marcus did exactly that, filing an emergency motion with the court documenting Mrs. Delaney's attempts to harass and intimidate our witnesses. He included sworn statements from Isabella, from me, and even from Gloria, who had received threatening phone calls telling her to withdraw her testimony or face legal consequences. Judge Rodriguez was not pleased. She called an emergency hearing and demanded that Mrs. Delaney's lawyers explain their client's actions. The lead lawyer tried to claim they knew nothing about any private investigators or intimidation tactics, but Marcus had receipts showing payments from Mrs. Delaney's company to the investigation firm. "Mrs. Delaney," Judge Rodriguez said, her voice sharp as a knife, "I am warning you and your legal team right now. If I hear of one more instance of witness intimidation or harassment, I will hold you in contempt of court and impose sanctions that will make your legal fees look like pocket change." Do I make myself absolutely clear? Mrs. Delaney, for the first time since this whole thing began, looked genuinely rattled. She nodded quickly and murmured, "Yes, Your Honor." That night, I received an unexpected phone call. It was from Charlie, Noah's wife, and her voice was different from any conversation we had ever had before. There was no smugness, no condescension, just something that sounded almost like fear. "Marilyn, we need to talk. Can I come see you tomorrow? Alone?" I agreed to meet Charlie the next day, more out of curiosity than any hope of reconciliation. She arrived at my small apartment in the afternoon, dressed much more casually than I had ever seen her, without the designer clothes and expensive jewelry she usually flaunted. She looked tired, older somehow, as if the stress of the past few weeks had aged her. We sat across from each other at my small kitchen table, the same table where I had cried after that humiliating dinner, the same table where I had discovered Margaret's letter. The silence between us was heavy and awkward, neither of us quite knowing how to begin. Finally, Charlie spoke, her voice quiet and strained. "Marilyn, I came here to ask you to drop the lawsuit, not for my mother, but for Noah and our children. This whole situation is destroying our family. Noah is having panic attacks, he can't sleep, he's terrified of what might happen if your case goes forward. The kids keep asking why Grandma Marilyn doesn't visit anymore, why their other grandmother is so upset all the time. It's affecting everyone." I felt a flicker of sympathy for my grandchildren, but I kept my voice firm. "Charlie, I didn't create this situation. Your mother built her entire fortune on stolen work, and my son chose to humiliate me rather than stand by his own mother. If there's destruction happening, it's because of choices your family made, not because of my lawsuit." Charlie's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time since I had known her, she looked genuinely vulnerable. "I know my mother isn't perfect, Marilyn. I've known for years that some of her success came from taking advantage of other people, but she's still my mother, and I can't just abandon her. Just like Noah can't abandon her, even though I think deep down, he knows you're probably telling the truth." Those words surprised me. "Noah thinks I'm telling the truth?" Charlie nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "He won't admit it, especially not to me or my mother, but I've seen him late at night, looking through old family photos, reading articles about the case. He's conflicted, Marilyn. Part of him wants to believe you, but the other part is terrified of what it means if you're right, that he married into a family built on lies, that he humiliated his own mother for defending the truth." I felt my own eyes getting wet, but I forced myself to stay strong. Then maybe Noah needs to face that truth and decide what kind of man he wants to be. Does he want to be someone who stands by what's right, even when it's uncomfortable? Or does he want to be someone who chooses wealth and status over integrity and family? Charlie was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her hands. When she looked up at me again, there was something different in her expression, something I couldn't quite read. "What if I helped you, Marilyn? What if I testified about things I've heard my mother say over the years, conversations I've overheard, documents I've seen? Would that make you consider settling this quietly, instead of going through a public trial?" I was stunned. Was Charlie really offering to betray her own mother to protect her husband and children from the fallout of a trial? Or was this some kind of trick? A way to get inside information about our case that she could report back to Mrs. Delaney? I chose my words carefully. "Charlie, if you have information that supports our case, then yes, I would want to hear it. But I'm not dropping this lawsuit. Too many people have been hurt by your mother's actions, and they deserve justice. However, if you genuinely want to do the right thing, then I will listen to what you have to say." Charlie took a deep breath and began talking, and what she told me over the next hour was absolutely devastating to Mrs. Delaney's case. She described conversations where her mother had bragged about how easy it was to take ideas from desperate, ambitious young chefs who would do anything for a chance to work with a famous name. She talked about seeing her mother go through recipe submissions from fans and viewers, copying the best ones into her own notebooks with no intention of ever crediting the creators. Most damning of all, Charlie revealed that her mother kept a private safe in her home office containing the original documents from her legal settlements with the women she had paid off over the years, including copies of the recipes they had accused her of stealing. If we could get access to that safe, we would have absolute proof of a pattern of theft spanning decades. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, genuinely confused about her motives. "Your mother will be destroyed if this information comes out." Charlie's voice was barely a whisper when she answered, "Because I'm tired of living with lies, Marilyn. I'm tired of pretending my mother is this perfect, self-made woman when I know the truth. And I'm tired of watching my husband suffer because he chose loyalty to her over loyalty to you. Maybe if the truth comes out, really comes out, we can all finally stop pretending and deal with reality." She stood up to leave, but paused at the door. "I'm not promising I'll testify publicly, Marilyn. I need to think about my children and what this will mean for them. But I wanted you to know that not everyone in my family is against you. And I wanted to say I'm sorry for how Noah and I treated you that night at dinner. You didn't deserve that." After she left, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. Charlie's information could be the final piece of evidence we needed to win this case decisively. But could I trust her? Was this a genuine olive branch? Or was she playing some kind of complicated game? I didn't understand. I called Marcus immediately and told him about the conversation. He was skeptical at first, warning me that Charlie could be trying to set us up or gather information for Mrs. Delaney's defense team. But he also acknowledged that if what she said was true, especially about the safe containing settlement documents and stolen recipes, it could be a game changer. The question is, how do we verify her information without tipping off Mrs. Delaney that her own daughter is talking to us? Marcus said thoughtfully. If Charlie is serious about helping, she needs to be willing to do more than just talk. She needs to provide actual evidence. I thought about this for a moment, and then I had an idea. What if we ask Charlie to take photographs of the documents in that safe? She has access to her mother's house. She could do it without anyone knowing. It wouldn't be admissible in court directly, but it would tell us what's there, and we could use that information to subpoena the actual documents legally. Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering. That's risky, Marilyn. If Mrs. Delaney finds out her daughter is photographing private documents, it could put Charlie in serious danger, both legally and personally. We would be asking her to betray her own mother in a very tangible way. Are you sure you want to put her in that position? I thought about my grandchildren, about Noah, about the complicated web of family loyalty and betrayal that had brought us all to this point. No, I'm not sure, I admitted. But I think we should at least give Charlie the option. If she's serious about wanting the truth to come out, then this is her chance to prove it. If she refuses, or if this is all just a trick, then at least we'll know where she really stands. The next day, I called Charlie and explained what we needed. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone, and I could almost feel her internal struggle through the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaky, but determined. "I'll do it, but I need some time. My mother is very careful about that safe. She only opens it when she's alone. I'll need to wait for the right opportunity. Maybe when she's traveling for one of her restaurant openings. Give me 2 weeks." Those 2 weeks felt like the longest of my life. Every day, I woke up wondering if this was all a trap, if Mrs. Delaney's lawyers were going to show up at my door with evidence that I had tried to conspire with Charlie to steal documents. But nothing happened. No phone calls, no visits, just agonizing silence and waiting. And then, exactly 2 weeks later, Charlie called me at 2 a.m. Her voice was urgent and frightened. "I have the photos, over 300 of them. Marilyn, it's even worse than I thought. My mother has been doing this for 40 years. There are documents in that safe about women I've never even heard of. I need to send these to you right now. And then I need to figure out how to protect myself and my kids, because if my mother finds out what I've done, I don't know what she'll do." Within minutes, my phone was filled with image after image of documents that would completely dismantle Mrs. Delaney's defense. Settlement agreements with non-disclosure clauses, handwritten recipes with other people's names crossed out and replaced with E. Delaney, notes about conversations where she had deliberately taken ideas from employees and friends with no intention of giving credit, even emails to her lawyers asking how to legally protect herself from accusations of theft. It was a complete archive of 4 decades of systematic intellectual property theft, hidden away in a safe like buried treasure, proof that Mrs. Delaney had known exactly what she was doing and had carefully covered her tracks. I forwarded everything to Marcus immediately, and within hours he had verified that the documents appeared genuine. "Marilyn, this is incredible," he said, his voice filled with excitement. "We can use these photos to subpoena the actual documents from Mrs. Delaney's home. With this evidence, there's no way she can win at trial. She'll have to settle, and not on her terms but on ours." But even in that moment of triumph, I felt a deep sadness. Charlie had just destroyed her relationship with her mother to help me seek justice. Noah would eventually find out what his wife had done, and it would tear their family apart even more. My grandchildren would grow up knowing their grandmother was a thief and their other grandmother had exposed her. There was no version of this story where everyone came out unscathed. The legal proceedings moved quickly after that. Marcus filed a motion to subpoena the contents of Mrs. Delaney's safe, providing Judge Rodriguez with the photographs as evidence that relevant documents existed. Mrs. Delaney's lawyers fought it desperately, arguing that the safe contained privileged personal documents protected by privacy laws, but the judge wasn't buying it. If the documents in that safe relate to a pattern of intellectual property theft, then they are absolutely relevant to this case. Judge Rodriguez ruled. The defendant has 10 days to provide complete access to the safe's contents for legal review, or I will find her in contempt and issue a warrant to seize the materials by force. Mrs. Delaney's face went pale when she heard the ruling. She knew she was trapped. Within a week, her lawyers approached Marcus with a settlement offer, but this time it wasn't $50,000 to make me go away. It was a multi-million-dollar settlement that included public acknowledgement of the theft, a formal apology to Margaret's memory and all the other women she had stolen from, and the removal of the stolen recipes from all her cookbooks and restaurant menus. But there was something else in the offer that caught me completely off guard. Mrs. Delaney was willing to fund a culinary scholarship in Margaret's name, a program that would provide training and financial support to aspiring chefs from low-income backgrounds, ensuring that their ideas and creativity would be protected and credited properly. When Marcus read me the terms of the settlement, I couldn't quite believe it. This was more than I had ever hoped for. Not just financial compensation, but genuine acknowledgement and a way to honor Margaret's legacy that would help future generations. But part of me was still angry, still wanted to see Mrs. Delaney face a public trial and complete humiliation. I talked to Father Mateo about it, asking for his wisdom and guidance. We sat in his small apartment while Isabella made tea, and the old priest listened carefully to my conflicted feelings. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, his eyes closed as if in prayer. Finally, he spoke, and his words changed everything. Marilyn, my child, revenge and justice are not the same thing. Revenge is about making someone suffer because they made you suffer. Justice is about making things right, about healing wounds and preventing future harm. This settlement offers real justice, not just for you, but for Margaret, for Gloria, for Yolanda, for all the women whose work was stolen, and for countless future chefs who will benefit from that scholarship program. If you reject it just to see Mrs. Delaney suffer more publicly, then you're choosing revenge over justice, and that's a poison that will eat at your soul. His words hit me hard because I knew he was right. I had spent so many nights imagining Mrs. Delaney's public downfall, picturing her empire crumbling, her reputation destroyed, her face on the front page of newspapers with the word thief underneath. But would that really honor Margaret's memory? Would it really heal the pain I felt over Noah's betrayal and the loss of my family? Isabella added her own perspective, her voice gentle but firm. My father taught me that the goal of seeking justice shouldn't be to destroy the person who wronged you, but to prevent them from wronging others and to create something positive out of the pain. This settlement does that, Marilyn. It stops Mrs. Delaney from stealing anyone else's work. It acknowledges what she did, and it creates a lasting legacy in your mother-in-law's name. Isn't that what Margaret would have wanted? I thought about Margaret, about the woman I had known through my husband's stories, about her kindness and generosity even in the face of betrayal and illness. She had given that recipe book to Father Mateo not because she wanted revenge, but because she wanted the truth to be known someday. She wanted her legacy protected, not necessarily her enemy destroyed. With tears streaming down my face, I told Marcus to accept the settlement. The announcement was made public 2 days later, and the reaction was explosive. Every major food publication ran stories about the case, about the pattern of theft that had been exposed, about the women who had come forward. Mrs. Delaney's reputation was indeed damaged, but not completely destroyed. Some people defended her, saying that recipe sharing was complicated and that intellectual property in cooking was a gray area. Others condemned her harshly, calling for boycotts of her restaurants and products. But the most important reaction came from the culinary community itself. Young chefs, food bloggers, cookbook authors, and restaurant workers started sharing their own stories about times when their ideas had been stolen, when they had been taken advantage of by people with more power and resources. The case became a catalyst for a larger conversation about credit, creativity, and exploitation in the food industry. The settlement money was distributed among all the women who had joined the lawsuit. I received a significant portion, enough to pay off all my debts, secure my housing for the rest of my life, and even set aside money for my grandchildren's education. Gloria used her share to finally open the small bakery she had dreamed about for decades. Yolanda was able to leave her line cook job and start consulting for restaurants, finally getting the recognition she deserved. And the Margaret Hayes Culinary Scholarship was established with a substantial endowment, providing full funding for 10 aspiring chefs every year, along with legal protection to ensure their work would always be properly credited. The first recipients were announced 6 months later, and I was invited to attend the ceremony and speak about Margaret's legacy. But through all of this, I still hadn't heard from Noah. The silence from my son was a constant ache in my heart, a reminder that winning the legal case hadn't fixed the broken relationship that had started this whole journey. Charlie had called me a few times, always brief and awkward, telling me that Noah was struggling with everything that had happened, that he didn't know how to process the revelation about his mother-in-law, that he was angry at everyone, including himself. "He knows he was wrong, Marilyn," Charlie told me during one of these calls. "He knows he should have believed you from the start, but admitting that means facing how badly he failed you, and I think he's too ashamed to do that right now. Please be patient with him." I wanted to be patient, but part of me was also tired of waiting for my adult son to find the courage to apologize to his own mother. I had fought this entire battle, had exposed a powerful woman's decades of theft, had created a lasting legacy for my mother-in-law, and through it all, my own son couldn't even pick up the phone to say he was sorry. Then, one evening, about 8 months after the settlement was finalized, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find Noah standing there, and he looked terrible. His eyes were red and swollen, his face was haggard, and he was holding a bouquet of flowers that looked like he had grabbed them from a grocery store at the last minute. We stood there, staring at each other for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Noah's voice cracked, and he said the words I had been waiting to hear for so long. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." I let Noah into my apartment, and we sat down at that same kitchen table where so much of this story had unfolded. He couldn't stop crying, his whole body shaking with the force of his emotions. I sat across from him, my own heart breaking and healing at the same time, waiting for him to find the words he needed to say. "I don't even know where to start, Mom," he said between sobs. "I've been such an idiot, such a coward. When I spit out your food that night, when I said those horrible things, I knew even then that something felt wrong, but I was so desperate to fit in with Charlie's family, to be accepted by her wealthy parents, to prove that I was worthy of their world. I thought that meant rejecting where I came from. Rejecting you." He looked up at me with devastated eyes. "And then when you filed the lawsuit?" I was terrified. "Mrs. Delaney and Charlie kept telling me you were lying, that you were trying to destroy our family for money, and I wanted to believe them because the alternative was too painful. If you were telling the truth, it meant I had humiliated my own mother for defending liars and thieves. It meant I had chosen status over integrity, exactly like you said." I reached across the table and took his hand, and he gripped it desperately like a drowning man holding onto a rope. "What changed, Noah? Why are you here now?" He wiped his eyes and took a shaky breath. "Charlie told me what she did, how she photographed those documents in her mother's safe. At first, I was furious with her. I felt betrayed that she had gone behind everyone's back. But then she showed me some of the photos before she deleted them from her phone, and I saw with my own eyes what kind of person my mother-in-law really is. All those settlements, all those stolen recipes, all those women whose careers were destroyed. And I realized that you had been trying to expose this the whole time, and instead of supporting you, I had attacked you." Noah's voice became even more choked with emotion. "I've spent the last 8 months trying to figure out how to face you, Mom. How do you apologize for something so unforgivable? How do you ask your mother for forgiveness when you chose rich strangers over her? When you spit in her face, both literally and figuratively? I convinced myself you would never want to see me again, that I had destroyed our relationship forever. I squeezed his hand tighter. Noah, you hurt me more deeply than I can ever explain. That night at the dinner and your phone call after I filed the lawsuit, those moments broke something inside me that I'm still trying to heal. But you're my son, and I love you, and I never stopped loving you even when I was angry and disappointed. The question isn't whether I can forgive you. The question is whether you can forgive yourself and whether you're willing to do the work to rebuild what was broken. He nodded, tears still streaming down his face. I want to do that work, Mom. I want to be the son you deserve, the man Dad would have been proud of. Charlie and I have been going to therapy together, trying to process everything that's happened. We're teaching the kids about integrity and standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. And I've been reading everything I can find about Grandma Margaret, about her life and her recipes, trying to understand the legacy I rejected. We talked for hours that night, really talked in a way we hadn't done in years. Noah told me about how the revelation of Mrs. Delaney's theft had created a massive rift in his marriage, how Charlie was estranged from her mother now and struggling with her own guilt and pain. He described watching his mother-in-law's empire slowly crumble as sponsors pulled their support and restaurants began removing her name from their brands. He admitted that part of him felt satisfied seeing her face consequences, but another part just felt sad about the whole situation. I told him about the scholarship program, about meeting the first recipients and seeing their excitement and gratitude. I shared stories about the other women who had come forward, about how they were rebuilding their careers and reclaiming their voices. I explained that while the legal victory was important, the real triumph was in creating something positive out of pain, something that would help future generations. Before Noah left that night, he asked if he could bring Charlie and the kids to visit me the following weekend. The children miss you so much, Mom. They keep asking when they can see Grandma Marilyn again, when you're going to bake cookies with them like you used to. And Charlie, she wants to apologize to you in person. She knows what she did to you in the past was wrong, and she wants to try to make it right. I agreed, and that weekend my small apartment was filled with the sound of children's laughter for the first time in months. My grandchildren had grown so much, and they threw themselves into my arms with the uncomplicated love that only children can offer. Charlie did apologize, sincerely and without excuses. And I could see that she had been changed by everything that had happened, that the superficial woman who had looked down on me was becoming someone with more depth and integrity. We baked cookies together that afternoon, using one of Margaret's recipes from the old cookbook. I taught my grandchildren the techniques that had been passed down through generations, explaining that these recipes were more than just instructions for making food. They were a connection to our family's history and values. Noah watched with tears in his eyes as his children learned from me, as they proudly presented their lumpy, imperfect cookies and insisted that these were the best cookies in the whole world. Over the following months, Noah and I slowly rebuilt our relationship. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of tension and pain, times when old hurts resurfaced and we had to work through them carefully. But we were both committed to healing, both willing to put in the effort required to move forward. Charlie's relationship with her mother remained broken, and I could see how much that cost her, even though she knew she had done the right thing. Mrs. Delaney had tried to contact her several times, alternating between rage and attempts at manipulation, but Charlie had held firm. She told me once, during a quiet conversation while the kids were playing, that betraying her mother had been the hardest thing she had ever done, but also the most necessary. I couldn't let my children grow up believing that success built on theft and lies was something to be proud of, she said. I want them to see their parents choosing integrity, even when it costs us everything. That's a legacy worth more than all the money and status my mother's empire ever provided. About a year after the settlement, I was invited to speak at a culinary conference about the case and its impact on the industry. Standing on that stage in front of hundreds of chefs, food writers, and industry professionals, I felt a mix of nervousness and pride. I told Margaret's story, described the decades of silence and theft, explained how a simple letter hidden in an old recipe book had started a chain of events that had exposed widespread exploitation and led to real change. But the most powerful part of my speech came when I talked about forgiveness and healing. I explained that while seeking justice was important, it couldn't be driven solely by revenge or hatred. I shared how Father Mateo's wisdom had guided me toward a settlement that honored Margaret's memory, while also creating something positive for future generations. And I admitted openly that the hardest part of the entire journey had been the fracture in my relationship with my son, and that winning the legal case had meant nothing if I couldn't also find a way to rebuild my family. When I finished speaking, the applause was thunderous. But what moved me most was seeing Noah standing at the back of the room, having come to support me without telling me he would be there. After the speech, he made his way through the crowd and hugged me tightly. And I heard him whisper in my ear, "I'm so proud of you, Mom. Dad would be proud too." Father Mateo's health continued to decline, and about 18 months after the settlement, Isabella called me with the news I had been dreading. Her father had passed away peacefully in his sleep, his hand held by his daughter, his conscience clear after finally telling the truth he had carried for so many years. The funeral was beautiful and heartbreaking. The church was packed with people whose lives Father Mateo had touched over his many decades of service. During the eulogy, I was asked to speak about his role in seeking justice for Margaret. I told the assembled mourners that Father Mateo had taught me the difference between revenge and justice, that he had shown me how truth could heal rather than destroy, and that his courage in testifying despite his failing health had made everything possible. Isabella and I became close friends after her father's death, bonded by our shared experience of fighting for justice together. She told me that one of her father's last requests had been that I continue to be involved with the scholarship program to help guide young chefs the way Margaret would have wanted. I promised I would, and that promise became one of the most fulfilling parts of my life. The second year of the Margaret Hayes Culinary Scholarship brought 10 more talented young chefs into the program, and I was asked to mentor one of them personally. Her name was Sophia, a 22-year-old from a small town in New Mexico who had grown up cooking with her grandmother and dreamed of opening a restaurant that would honor traditional Native American and Mexican fusion cuisine. Working with Sophia, teaching her not just recipes but also how to protect her ideas and build a career with integrity, became a source of joy I hadn't expected. One afternoon, while we were cooking together in my small kitchen, Sophia asked me if I regretted all the pain and conflict that came from pursuing the lawsuit. I thought carefully before answering. There were many nights when I cried myself to sleep, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake. But then I would think about Margaret, about all the women whose work was stolen, about young people like you who deserve to enter this industry, knowing their creativity will be protected. Some things are worth fighting for, even when the cost is high. Around this time, something unexpected happened. I received a handwritten letter from Mrs. Delaney herself, the first direct communication since the settlement. She wrote about her childhood growing up poor, about her desperate ambition to escape poverty. She described how the first time she took credit for someone else's recipe, it had felt like a small, harmless lie. But then that lie led to another until she was trapped in a web of her own making. The most striking part came near the end. Mrs. Delaney admitted that when Margaret had confronted her decades ago, she had known Margaret was dying and wouldn't have the strength to fight. She wrote that this decision had haunted her for 40 years. "Your lawsuit forced me to face consequences I had avoided for decades. It destroyed my reputation and cost me millions of dollars, but it also freed me from the burden of lies I had carried for so long. My daughter no longer speaks to me, but in a strange way, I sleep better now because the truth is finally out." The letter concluded with a personal apology that acknowledged the specific harm she had caused to Margaret, to me, and to all the women whose work she had stolen. I showed the letter to Noah when he visited. He read it carefully and surprised me with his mature response. "You should do whatever feels right for you, Mom. If responding to her helps with your peace of mind, then do it." I eventually wrote back to Mrs. Delaney, a short letter that acknowledged her apology and suggested that if she truly wanted to demonstrate remorse, she could contribute to the Margaret Hayes Scholarship Fund. To my surprise, she did exactly that, making a substantial donation and also beginning to work quietly with some of the women she had stolen from, helping them publish their own cookbooks and supporting their businesses financially. As the years passed, the story became a landmark case in the culinary world. Law schools taught it as an example of intellectual property issues. Young chefs entering the industry knew the story and understood the importance of protecting their work. The scholarship grew beyond anything I could have imagined, eventually providing not just financial support, but also legal resources to help young chefs protect their intellectual property. Sophia opened her restaurant 5 years after receiving her scholarship, and I attended the grand opening. She had named one of her signature dishes, the Margaret, a tribute to my mother-in-law's legacy. During the opening night dinner, Sophia called me to stand beside her and made a toast. This restaurant exists because of this woman. Mrs. Hayes fought a battle she didn't have to fight, stood up to powerful people who tried to silence her, and sacrificed her relationship with her own son to ensure that people like me would have a fair chance in this industry. My oldest grandchild, now a teenager, told me she had written an essay for school about what I had done. "You're kind of famous now, Grandma. My friends think it's cool that my grandmother fought against a rich villain and won. They say you're like a superhero." I laughed and hugged her tight. "I'm not a superhero, sweetheart. I'm just a grandmother who loved her family and wanted to honor a woman who couldn't fight for herself anymore." Over the next several years, I received hundreds of letters from people inspired by the story, not just chefs, but artists, writers, musicians, and creators of all kinds who had experienced similar theft. One letter that particularly moved me came from a woman named Grace, now in her 80s, who had been a young chef in the 60s. She wrote that the male head chef had regularly taken credit for her creations, but she had stayed silent because that's what women did back then. "Reading about what you did made me realize that my silence had enabled the mistreatment of Vord. Countless women who came after me," Grace wrote. "Thank you for having the courage I lacked. You've given me peace in my final years." My relationship with Noah continued to deepen. He and Charlie eventually divorced, not because of the lawsuit but because they realized their marriage had been built on social ambition rather than genuine compatibility. The divorce was amicable, and they remained committed to co-parenting. Noah moved back to Albany into a modest apartment not far from mine, and we began having weekly dinners together, cooking using Margaret's old recipes. "I spent so many years trying to be someone I thought was better than who I actually was," Noah told me during one dinner. "I was ashamed of our simple life, but all it did was disconnect me from the things that actually mattered. I'm sorry it took something so painful for me to learn that lesson." Charlie remarried a few years later to a high school teacher, a quiet, kind man who treated her with genuine respect. She seemed happier than I had ever seen her. She brought her new husband to meet me and told me, "Thank you for teaching me what real strength looks like. Watching you stand up to my mother showed me what courage actually means." Mrs. Delaney never fully rehabilitated her reputation, but she continued her quiet work of making amends, reaching out to everyone she had wronged. I ran into her once by accident at a farmer's market, about 6 years after the settlement. She approached me slowly, her face showing vulnerability I had never seen before. "Mrs. Hayes, I want you to know that not a day goes by that I don't think about what I did. The scholarship fund, the restitution I've made, none of it can undo the past, but I hope it shows I'm trying to be better." I felt something unexpected. Pity, not contempt. "Mrs. Delaney, I appreciate that you're trying to make amends. I won't say I've forgiven you, but I can acknowledge that you're taking responsibility, and that matters." We talked, briefly, an awkward but genuine conversation between two women who had been enemies but who had both been changed by our battle. When we parted, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't known I needed. The Margaret Hayes Culinary Scholarship celebrated its 10th anniversary with a gala event in New York City. Over 100 past recipients attended. I gave the keynote speech, talking about Margaret, about the importance of protecting creative work, and about how even the most painful experiences can lead to positive change if we choose to transform our pain into purpose. When I finished speaking, Sophia started a standing ovation, followed by every scholarship recipient in the room. Noah was in the audience with my grandchildren, all on their feet. After the event, a young woman named Carmen approached me and showed me a worn photograph of 2 young women cooking together. One was Margaret, and the other was Carmen's great-grandmother, Rosa. They were friends in the 80s, Carmen explained. "When I got accepted into this scholarship and learned the story behind it, my grandmother found this photo. I wanted you to have it, so you could see how much Margaret's kindness meant to our family too." I stared at that photograph and realized there were probably hundreds of stories like this, people whose lives had been touched by Margaret's generosity, connections that had rippled forward through time. The years continued to pass, bringing new developments that reminded me why the struggle had been worthwhile. My grandchildren grew into thoughtful young adults. My oldest granddaughter decided to study law, inspired by how legal action could seek justice. My grandson became interested in cooking and asked to learn all of Margaret's recipes. Noah rebuilt his life with humility and authenticity he had lacked before. "I spent years being ashamed of you, Mom," he said during one of our dinners. "But now I realize you were doing something much harder and more valuable than chasing status. You were living with integrity. I'm so sorry it took me so long to see that." Isabella and I remained close friends. We would visit Father Mateo's grave together, telling him about the ongoing impact of the case. "He carried guilt for staying silent for so many years," Isabella explained. "Being able to testify freed him from decades of regret. You gave him that gift." The scholarship continued to grow, expanding to include mentorship, legal resources, business training, and networking. Sophia's restaurant became celebrated for her innovative approach to indigenous cuisines. Every year, on the anniversary of receiving her scholarship, she donated profits to the fund, inspiring other recipients to do the same. Gloria published her own cookbook that told her story honestly and showcased her recipes. The book became a modest bestseller, and she used the proceeds to fund a small culinary school, offering free classes to aspiring chefs from low-income backgrounds. "For so many years, I felt like a failure," Gloria told me. "But winning that lawsuit gave me permission to reclaim my identity as a chef." Mrs. Delaney lived out her remaining years quietly, withdrawn from public life. Her restaurant empire was sold off, with money going to restitution funds and charitable causes. She published one final cookbook of her own original recipes. When she passed away at 81, Charlie told me it had been one of the saddest days of her life, mourning the relationship they never had. On what would have been Margaret's 95th birthday, the scholarship program dedicated a permanent memorial in her honor at the Culinary Institute of America. The ceremony was attended by hundreds of people. Noah gave a speech, admitting how he had once rejected the family legacy, but had come to understand its value through painful experience. When it was my turn to speak, I talked about how Margaret had been betrayed, but had left behind evidence and hope that someday justice would be served. Margaret never lived to see this moment, but she left behind a trail of breadcrumbs that was enough. It reminds us that truth has power, even when it seems powerless. After the ceremony, Noah and I stood together, looking at Margaret's memorial plaque. He put his arm around me. "I understand now, Mom. I understand why you did what you did. It wasn't about revenge. It was about dignity, about refusing to let someone's life and work be erased. You taught me that some things are more important than comfort, and I promise I'll teach that to my kids too." The journey from that devastating dinner to this moment had been long and painful. But standing there beside my son, I knew it had been worth it. The most important outcome wasn't the legal victory or even the changes in the industry. It was the healing of my relationship with Noah and understanding that choosing integrity over comfort was the right decision. I learned that justice isn't always satisfying in the way we imagine. Mrs. Delaney never truly suffered in proportion to the harm she caused. But justice was still served through exposure of the truth, through systemic changes, through a scholarship that turned pain into opportunity. Most importantly, the opposite of injustice isn't revenge, it's restoration, taking what was broken and building something better. 10 years after Margaret's memorial dedication, I received an invitation that brought everything full circle. The Culinary Institute of America was establishing a new ethics program and wanted to name it after me. The Marilyn Center for Culinary Ethics and Justice would focus on teaching emerging chefs about intellectual property, fair credit practices, and standing up against exploitation. I was 85 years old, still cooking every day, still mentoring young chefs. The dedication ceremony was attended by over 500 people, including nearly every scholarship recipient. Sophia was there with her teenage daughter. Gloria attended, now in her 90s. Isabella came with her own children. The most meaningful moment came when Noah spoke. "My mother taught me the hardest lesson anyone can learn. She taught me that love sometimes means letting people face the consequences of their choices. She could have dropped that lawsuit to keep peace with me, but she chose truth and justice over my approval, and that choice saved me from a life built on false values. I lost years with my mother because of my pride, but I found my soul in the process of finding my way back to her. The center opened its doors 6 months later. I watched young chefs learn about their rights, about how to protect their work, about the history of exploitation in the industry. On my 87th birthday, I received a video message from Carmen, now head chef at a prestigious restaurant. Mrs. Hayes, everything I've achieved exists because you decided Margaret's story mattered enough to fight for. Thank you for being our champion. A few weeks later, I woke up one morning feeling lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. I made tea and sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where everything had begun. I felt Margaret's presence strongly, as if she were sitting across from me, smiling with satisfaction. "We did it, Margaret," I whispered. "Your story was told. Justice was served. And something beautiful grew from all that pain." That night, Noah came for our weekly dinner. We cooked together using one of Margaret's recipes. Before he left, he hugged me tightly. "I love you, Mom, and I'm so proud of you. You're my hero." Those words were worth every tear I had cried, every sacrifice I had made. We had both been broken by this journey, but we had also both been healed. As I prepared for bed, I looked at the framed photograph Carmen had given me, showing young Margaret and Rosa cooking together. Next to it was a recent photo of Sophia and Carmen cooking side by side. 2 generations, separated by decades, 2 friendships, born in kitchens, 2 stories of women who had experienced both betrayal and redemption. I turned off the light and closed my eyes, feeling more at peace than I had in years. The story that had begun with a hidden letter that had required me to risk everything was finally complete. Not with a Hollywood ending, but with something more real and valuable. Genuine transformation, lasting change, and the knowledge that choosing integrity over comfort was always worth the cost. "Rest well, my dear friend," I whispered into the night. "Your recipes are safe now. Your story is told, and your legacy lives on in ways you never could have imagined." That was enough. That was everything.